So now that I've integrated the standard assets into an existing Unity project, I can access and utilize some of the assets that came in standard assets. And so the way that I'm going to access this content is I'm going to go to my project tab, into my assets folder, and I'm going to go into the standard assets. Now, have this column set up here to where I can navigate, but I also have these breadcrumbs along the top in case I want to kind of navigate back and forth. So I'm inside standard assets. I have a project open that has a terrain, and the first thing I'm going to do is incorporate a first person controller so I can walk around and evaluate my environment. After we do that, I understand that folks are having a couple of issues incorporating water into the equation, and so I'll get that up and running as well. And then we'll move on to painting terrain and sculpting and just kind of update some of the new features in Unity. So the first thing I'm going to do is incorporate a rigid body first person controller. So if I know the title of this thing or know some keywords, I can just search for the asset, but I will show you where this is located. So I'm going to go into standard assets, double click on characters, and I'm going to go to first person character. Once I get into the first person character subfolder, I want to look into the prefabs. Now, prefabs are just prefabricated game objects. It's a combination of a couple of different assets that are pre-configured for us to work, and then configured as a library object. We'll talk about making prefabs in future, actually towards the end of this project. I want to point out there are two different first person controllers. There's an FPS controller, and then there's a rigid body first person controller. We're going to use the rigid body first person controller based on the way that we're going to make our interactions for the core mechanics of our island game. It's going to be a little bit easier if we have a rigid body attached to it, and it'll give us a couple of benefits. So I'm making sure that I've selected the rigid body first person controller, and I'm just going to drag it out into my environment, and I'll raise it up a little bit. So at this point, I should be able to walk around my environment. I have a first person controller. I have my environment created. I'm going to hit the play button and make sure that I can walk around. Now I'm a little low to the ground. We can resolve that a couple different ways, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. But I can use the AWSD keys and I can look around, and I'm pretty satisfied with that. So I've integrated the rigid body first person controller, and I'm going to incorporate some water right here just so that we can walk through that process as well. What I'm going to do, in fact, I'm going to move my first person controller just up on this hill a little bit, so I'm just kind of watching where my first person controller is. And just a reminder, if we end up, let's say, in kind of a strange place, if I go way over, oops, didn't want to do that. If I would go way over here and I get disoriented and kind of turned around and I don't know where my first person controller is, all I have to do is go find the rigid body first person controller and just double click on it. That will frame that object to our scene window. So I'm going to scroll back a little bit with my mouse, reconfigure the window after I just mangled it, and I'm going to incorporate some water. So I got up on the hill, sort of. That should be good enough. And I'm going to put some water down here. I'll be a little heavy-handed with this just for the sake of the demo. In order to utilize water, all we have to do is just make sure that we're using the right assets. So I'm going to go to Standard Assets. Inside Standard Assets, I'm going to go to Environment, and from Environment, I'm going to go to Water. Now, there's a couple of different waters here. I'm going to use the Advanced Water, so it's not the basic water. I'll double click, and then we have a couple of different options. We have Water 4, and we have Water. We want to go just into Water. In fact, we don't even really want this Water 4. It's from a previous version. It's very efficient, just looks a little bit different. If I want to, I could just select that folder and hit delete on a PC or command delete on a Mac and just get rid of that. There's no harm in getting rid of assets in the asset folder if you absolutely know you don't need them. There are some dependencies in here though, so we got to be mindful of that. But in this case, we're not even going to use the Water 4. I found it kind of confusing, and so I just got rid of it. So I'm in Assets, Standard Assets, Environment, Water, and I'm going to go into the water. A little redundancy here, but that's the way Unity set it up. And now we have all of the resources that go into making this advanced water. Now, when you come across assets that have lots of different stuff. If you feel disoriented, usually we're looking for a prefabricated game object that utilizes scripts and textures and materials and maybe some other things. But this gives us access to two different prefabs. One's a daytime water and one's a nighttime water. And really the difference is kind of in the materials and how it handles reflections and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to take this Water Pro Daytime and just drag it out and drop it into my environment. Now, it created a little disk of water. I'm going to lift this up so we can see this a little bit more clearly. Okay, so we're getting all the reflection. Looks like a little puddle. If we're trying to make something bigger, we just increase the X and the Z values. So I got this little puddle here, and I'm raising it and lowering it according to the terrain. So I'll just lift it up a little bit here. And with that Water Daytime Pro selected, I'm going to go to my transform component. I'm going to go to scale, and you can see that X is already scaled out to 16, so is Z. And I'm just going to add a 0 to the end of that, both X and Z. And now you see I have a lot more water to deal with. I could have multiple instances of water, but effectively what I just did is I flooded this area. Okay, so as long as my first person controller is in an appropriate spot, I should be able to hit the play button and turn around and look at all the hard work I just did. So there's my water, kind of flooded the area, getting some kind of strange sparkly effects. It's because I have a lot of other effects turned on. I'll go through and kind of clean that up. Plus I'm in preview mode. So that's, a really high level overview of getting a rigid body first person controller and getting started with water inside our environment. I'll continue to build these tips and tricks based on questions that are asked either in email or in the discussion board. So if you have any other questions, make sure that you reach out. And have fun with this project, and we'll catch up soon.